is so tough for Zelensky. I mean, future historians will wonder how he hasn't been screaming into a pillow for 14 hours a day, because it must be so tough not only trying to get your position across, but to get the White House to understand basic information about this war.
Hi, I'm Maddie Hale and welcome to the Trump Report. We've got a lot going on today. We're going to stay kind of in the international space. There's a lot that's been happening between the US and Iran, Ukraine and Russia. There was also a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing that involved Marco Rubio. So there's a lot to discuss. So today I've got journalist and commentator Bethany Elliott on the show. And just a reminder that you can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on the Trump Report YouTube channel, or you can stream us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Bethany, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report again.
Hi, Maddie. Thank you so much for inviting me back.
We've got to speak about what happened on Wednesday night, which Donald Trump, he was pivoting away from domestic issues at home when he warned Iran that they were running out of time to negotiate a deal on a nuclear program. So this is what he said. He said a massive Armada is heading to Iran. It's moving quickly with great power, enthusiasm and purpose, ready, willing and able to rapidly fulfill its mission with speed and violence if necessary. Hopefully Iran will quickly come to the table and negotiate a fair and equitable deal. No nuclear weapons. Time is running out. Make a deal. They didn't, and there was Operation Midnight Hammer. The next attack will be far worse. So we saw the US strike in June last year, Bethany, and we've seen that the US Navy currently has ships positioned near the Middle East region, and then the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier and its accompanying strike group have also been deployed to the region. So if Iran doesn't make a deal in the next day or so, are we gearing up for another strike?
We could be. As you say, this isn't the first time that Trump has made these kinds of threats against Iran, because he's indicated in the past that he'll be willing to order military action in response to the crackdown on protests in Iran. But a couple of weeks ago, he claimed that Iran had cancelled the executions of over 800 people and that he respected Tehran for doing that. So it was a slightly odd choice of words there. But he now does seem to have gone back to the Iran issue. He didn't mention the protesters in his Truth Social post yesterday. It was all about the nuclear issue, saying that he wanted a fair and equitable deal, no nuclear weapons, and that, as you say, the next US attack would be far worse than last summer. And now we have reports of the USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group being in the region. This morning, there have been reports that Trump is considering a major strike because discussions between the US and Iran over Tehran's nuclear program and ballistic missile production are not making progress. And those could include possible strikes on specific Iranian military targets like members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard or weapons. Axios reported that he hasn't yet decided what action to take, but he might hold consultations this week. He'll be presented with military options from his advisors and then maybe move forwards from there. Washington is thought to be seeking the removal of all enriched uranium from Iran, along with a ban on enrichment and a cap on its arsenal of long-range missiles. And I think the big question is, why is he doing this now? And I think first and foremost, as always with Trump, with international affairs, it is a distraction from the domestic. We've seen that Trump has backed down recently over Greenland. He backed down with the remarks he made about NATO troops, and now he's de-escalated with Minnesota. So he needs to find an area of strength. He needs to find an area where he'll project. And I think he's also taking advantage of Iran's weakness at the moment. Marco Rubio said yesterday that Iran is weaker than it's ever been, and that protests might ebb now, but they will spark again in future. And we know that the New York Times reported that Trump has been receiving briefings, intelligence briefings, that the Iranian regime has its weakest grip on power since the revolution in 1979. It might also be an emotional thing. We know with Trump that he does seem to be affected by stories of killings. This happens with the war in Ukraine, where he was previously very shocked that his good friend Putin was conducting these mass bombings in Ukraine. The internet blocking in Iran has been partially lifted, so we're getting more of a sense of the crackdown. The human rights activist news agency says that at least 6,221 people are dead and over 42,000 Iranians have been arrested. So it might be that even though he didn't mention the protesters in his post, Trump has been affected by these things coming out. In terms of options, it could be a limited military action to punish the crackdown on protesters and deter future killings. Or is this a larger operation to spark more protests and destabilize the regime from within? Is this actual regime change in Iran? And I think that we don't know exactly how long he's been planning this, because there have been reports that military assets that had been around Venezuela in the lead up to the capture of Nicolas Maduro are now being moved, and that Trump was thinking earlier this month of striking Iran due to the deaths of protesters, but then he backed off. And so, how likely is a diplomatic solution at this stage? The Iranians are bound to be nervous. Last June, the two sides were talking when the US gave Israel the green light to launch an attack on Iran. And also, Tom Tugendhat, who's a conservative politician here in the UK, says that he has heard through his sources that Iran proxies like Hezbollah and the Houthis have been warned about any retaliatory action, which does seem like the US actually planning for the consequences if they do strike Iran. So US officials say at the moment there are no serious negotiations between the US and Iran. But also the question is, what happens if there is some kind of strike? Because it is going to lead to regional instability. Earlier in the month, Iran threatened to target US bases in the Middle East and Israel if it's attacked. The Israelis are reportedly concerned about the risk of some kind of reprisal from Iran. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which both host US forces, have already indicated they don't want to allow their airspace to be used for any attack. So Trump does not have the support of his regional Gulf allies for this. And Iran does have assets it can deploy. There are reports that the Chinese have been supplying new air defense systems. There's a US intelligence assessment that strikes in June last year only delayed the regime's nuclear program by months. And I think also Trump is buoyed perhaps by what happened in Venezuela being quite a swift operation. Iran is not Venezuela. Neither Maduro nor the Ayatollah are popular with their people, we know that. But regime change within Iran would be a lot trickier than in Venezuela, because it's like Maduro was betrayed and abandoned by people around him. We're not seeing any evidence of there being a movement within the Iranian political elite who would want change and who Trump could work with, so to speak. In his in his Truth Social, not Trump Social, in his Truth Social post, Trump said that this would be like Venezuela, but it's not like Venezuela. There is, of course, the Crown Prince, but how popular would he be? How swift would any transition of power be? And I think Trump needs to think as well about the domestic impact if he does move on Iran, because Politico did a survey, found that 65% of people support the US taking military action against at least one potential target country like Iran or Cuba or China. And 50% support military intervention against Iran, and that goes up to 61% for those who identify as MAGA Republicans. But it's a different story when we're talking about boots on the ground, regional instability, reprisals, and something that could go on for quite some time and unleash a degree of chaos within Iran.
And it's a wait and watch situation. There are reports that the Trump camp want answers from Iran within the next 24 hours. And as I mentioned, they've got the Navy there, an aircraft nearby. So we'll be waiting to see what happens there. But as you mentioned, yeah, it is different to what happened in Venezuela. Not quite sure if Trump's using that because he had a little bit more support when it came to capturing Maduro. But let's move on to a different conflict, Bethany. This is an interesting post that Donald Trump wrote overnight. He basically said that he'd had this conversation for an hour and 15 minutes with Vladimir Putin. He said, "We discussed the attack on Russia's docked airplanes by Ukraine and also various other attacks that have been taking place by both sides. It was a good conversation, but not a conversation that will lead to immediate peace." President Putin did say very strongly that he will have to respond to the recent attacks on the airfields. We also discussed Iran, and he went on to basically say that President Putin might help him with negotiations when it comes to Iran. Now, Trump seems to have only mentioned attacks from Ukraine to Russia in this post, despite the fact that Russian attacks have, in the last few days, targeted civilian infrastructure, energy facilities, and a passenger train that has killed multiple people. So I want to get your thoughts on this post, but I want to read out a few responses first. So here's what a few people said. So Michael McKay wrote on Twitter, "Putin puppet Trump agrees with his master that Ukrainians striking Russian military aircraft is a very bad thing. He has nothing to say about Russians striking a passenger train filled with Ukrainian civilians. Trump does nothing to hide to the fact that he works for Putin." Don Bacon, a Republican congressman, says, "Memo to President Trump, Putin and Khamenei hate us. They are our enemies." And then Adam Kinzinger wrote, "Putin just attacked and murdered civilians on a train, yet Trump is mad Ukraine hit military planes." So what are your thoughts on this, Bethany? This post, does it kind of emphasize what Michael McKay is saying? Does it prove that Trump is working for Putin?
I think the relationship between Trump and Putin is one of the most fascinating ones in Trump's life, because I genuinely think it shows who he is as a person. on the grounds that, of course, there have been rumors forever about the Steele file and blackmail and things like that. But I heard your show with Sir Bill Browder yesterday, where he was talking about how there was images of a photo of Trump with Putin on his wall next to the ones with his children. And it seems to be that Trump only respects people who, in his mind, project power. And it's a completely amoral perspective on the world because Putin is so good at working Trump. He knows that Trump wants to join this club of dictators, so to speak, that Trump does always prefer relations with people like Putin, Alexander Lukashenko, and Xi Jinping, for example, Kim Jong-un, on the grounds that he views them as strongmen dictators who don't have to deal with the checks and balances of democracy. And Putin works this, of course, because he tries to emphasize this friendship and say, well, if you're cool, then you can be part of our club, so to speak. And he goes along with all of Trump's ideas, like the idea of the 2020 election being stolen from him. So it is worrying that no matter how much effort Europe puts in to try to show Trump who Putin is as a person, Trump always comes back to these ideas that Putin is his friend and that they have this close relationship. And it is, as we see with this post, impacting on how he reacts to war in Ukraine.
And this is all happening, these attacks, Bethany, while this first trilateral meeting took place over the weekend. But the second trilateral meeting will take place again, pick up on this coming weekend. So this is happening while President Zelensky tweeted this. So these attacks are happening, and then he sent out this tweet saying, the Russians are preparing a new massive strike. Our intelligence indicates this. The US, Europe, and all of our partners have to understand how this discredits diplomatic talks. Every single Russian strike does. I wonder if this commentary from President Zelensky is falling on deaf ears.
I think it is, absolutely 100%. And I think that with Putin, don't pay attention to what he says, pay attention to how he uses his weapons, so to speak, because violence and force is the language that Putin uses. It's how he operates. On the one hand, tapping Trump along with these talks, as you say, the trilateral talks in Abu Dhabi, first since the war started. But on the other hand, preparing this massive strike. And we've seen this before because earlier this month, Russia fired an Oreshnik missile into western Ukraine. It was ostensibly retaliation for the highly dubious claims that Ukraine had attacked Putin's residence. But really, it was to show that they wouldn't accept Western peacekeepers in Ukraine. It was that sign. And this is how Putin works. This is his signaling. He uses weapons and he uses nuclear threats. And as you were saying, these attacks on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine are freezing Ukrainians. And it is not only about hurting Ukrainian civilians and degrading morale, it's also about trying to stop the capital from functioning as a city because it's impacting on businesses and schools and transport and the like. Putin wants Ukraine to be a failed state. We know that. If he can't take it over, then he will try to destroy it in any way he can. Yet Trump recently, of course, was saying that Putin wanted Ukraine to succeed. He fundamentally doesn't understand the situation. And I think we're seeing that those around Trump don't understand the situation either, because Ukrainian MP Alexander Moreshko, he didn't specifically name the US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, but he was saying there was somebody who was attached to real estate, who was very close to Trump, who was naive and inexperienced and fundamentally didn't understand the situation, that Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, is emerging as the more dominant of the pair, and also that, although he didn't name him, Witkoff had made basic mistakes on things like the war and how long it's been going on for. So it is so tough for Zelensky. I mean, future historians will wonder how he hasn't been screaming into a pillow for 14 hours a day, because it must be so tough not only trying to get your position across, but also to get the White House to understand basic information about this war.
What did you make of the fact that Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov said that Russia is inviting Zelensky to Moscow for direct talks if he's willing to come? Of course, he hasn't responded, but Russia claims they would guarantee Zelensky's safety and provide the conditions needed for negotiations in Moscow.
Yes. So he said that Russia would guarantee its safety. Russia, of course, the nation that invaded Ukraine, but also has engaged in very strong propaganda efforts consistently throughout this war to try and falsely portray Zelensky as a corrupt dictator. It has repeatedly sent death squads, Chechens and the Wagner group, in a bid to assassinate Zelensky personally. He survived multiple attempts on his life. Dmitry Medvedev, who used to be the president of Russia, called Zelensky a legitimate military target at one stage. So it is laughable, the idea that Russia would guarantee his safety, because Russia is the threat to his safety. And yeah, Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha said Zelensky is ready to meet with Putin to discuss the occupied territories and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which would seem to be the two main issues at the moment. But I think that the fact that Yuri Oshakov said this, it's a very typical Russian response because they're not taking the process seriously. They're not taking the negotiation process seriously. Putin does not want peace. So they throw up these kinds of issues throughout the negotiating process in a bid to destabilize it. And maybe Trump would take the bait and say, well, he's willing to meet you. But at the end of the day, Putin does not want to meet Zelensky because he only sees Trump as an equal. We saw that back in August at the Alaska talks. Putin does not view Ukraine as a real country, and he would not confer the status on Zelensky of being an equal and a leader by meeting with him. So no, this is just trying to generate a few lines. And Zelensky, fortunately, is intelligent enough to see this for the trap that it is.
There's been so much conversation this week about security guarantees for Ukraine from the US side. There's been multiple reports when it comes to these trilateral discussions that the US is saying that they potentially won't provide security guarantees or sign off on them until Ukraine concedes the Donbass. We know that that is non-negotiable on both Russia and Ukraine's side. So I want to show you a few clips from this. Bethany, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on Wednesday. I want to start with this clip when it comes to security guarantees. So this is what he said here.
There's a lot of talk about security guarantees. And it's something that there's general agreement about now with the case of Ukraine. But those security guarantees basically involve the deployment of a handful of European troops, primarily French in the UK, and then a U.S. backstop. But in fact, the security guarantee is the U.S. backstop. It is not and I'm not diminishing the fact that some countries in Europe are willing to place troops in a post-war Ukraine. What I'm pointing out is that is irrelevant without the U.S. backstop. And the reason why you need such a strong U.S. backstop is because our allies and our partners have not invested enough in their own defense capabilities over the last 20 or 30 years. Now, hopefully that's going to change. Hopefully that is changing.
So Marco Rubio is basically saying that for future security guarantees for Ukraine, Europe needs to provide most of the heavy lifting. Of course, this also means putting troops on the ground when the war is over. But he's saying, as it stands, Europe can't actually guarantee Ukraine's security on its own because they don't have the military strength or the resources to do it without American support, which means that the US would essentially have to commit to partake in future conflict. Is that what your takeaway from that was?
Yes, it was my takeaway from what he said. I also thought that it was interesting that he seemed to still be blaming Europe in some ways for the invasion, even though Rubio has himself traditionally been a hawk on Russia, because he was talking about Europe still buying Russian oil and that being a factor why Putin invaded. So it is interesting how even somebody like Rubio still feels the need to share blame around rather than squarely and forcefully saying that Putin and Putin alone is to blame for this situation. But no, that was my takeaway from what he said. Land is still the main issue. The Donbass, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, said that the Ukrainian armed forces must leave the Donbass, they must withdraw from there, and he said it's a very important condition. There are reports that Trump is not really pushing back against Russia on this. Back in Alaska, when they had those talks in August, the Russians put forward this claim that they needed the Donbass. It would be so tough for Ukraine to give it up. It is fortified land. It would be humiliating for Ukraine and for Zelensky personally to be the one ordering his people, after huge cost of life in defending it, out of that territory, civilians and men. So it would be very tough. But there are rumors that perhaps in those talks in August in Alaska, Trump went along with what the Russians wanted and even promised that he would give the Donbass. Even if that's not true, we're seeing this very typical Trump response where he doesn't want a good deal, he just wants a fast deal.
One of the other things that happened in this testimony, which was, of course, Rand Paul, he's come out and criticised the Trump administration for a few of the foreign policies. And he was questioning Marco Rubio over the decision to invade Venezuela and capture Maduro, as there has been a lot of pushback from Congress and congressional approval, even when they were originally striking these boats that were apparently drug smugglers. So I want to play this clip of Rand Paul asking whether Marco Rubio considers this an act of war and what would happen if this took place on US soil.
So I would ask you, if a foreign country bombed our air defense missiles, captured and removed our president, and blockaded our country, would that be considered an act of war?
Well, I think your question is about and I will acknowledge you've been very consistent on all these points the entire career. So let me no matter who's in charge. So I will point to two things. The first is it's hard for us to conceive that an operation that lasted about 4.5 hours and was a law enforcement operation to capture someone we don't recognize as the head of state, indicted in the United States, wanted with a $50 million bounty.
My question would be, if it only took 4 hours to take our president, it's very short, nobody dies on the other side, nobody dies on our side, it's perfect. Would it be an act of war?
We just don't believe that this operation comes anywhere close to the constitutional definition of war.
But would it be an act of war if someone did it to us? Nobody dies, few casualties, they're in and out. Boom, it's a perfect military operation. Would that be an act of war? Of course it would be an act of war. I'm probably the most anti-war person in the Senate, and I would vote to declare war if someone invaded our country and took our president. So I think we need to at least acknowledge this is a one-way argument. One-way arguments that don't rebound, that you can't apply to yourselves, that cannot be universally applicable are bad arguments.
So what was your takeaway from that, Bethany? Does it kind of show to you that there's friction within the Republican Party over the Venezuela debacle?
Potentially. And I think that Rubio's tone over Venezuela was really interesting because it was quite an aggressive tone. He was saying that funds from the sales of crude oil are being held in an offshore account in Qatar. They'll be transferred to a US Treasury blocked account in the US. And the Venezuelan government will then be able to request the use of those funds for their needs, and the US will be able to decide on releasing them, and that the profits will be spent on US-made goods rather than going to Russia or China. That was the idea. The question is, how does that go down in Venezuela? And also, he was also quite belligerent when he was threatening further military force, really, regarding Venezuela, saying we don't want that and we hope we don't have to use it, with the implication of, but we would if we have to. But yeah, I think we are definitely seeing signs of friction on the grounds that Marco Rubio was asked about success with this operation. And he said, we're not even 4 weeks into it and we're moving in the right direction. That was interesting that he didn't just say, yes, this is 100% a success. He was trying to sort of temper it. And then he said that the two necessities had been energy policy from Washington being set by Washington and Delcy Rodriguez being the leader. But I also thought it was interesting what he said on Cuba, on the grounds that Delcy Rodriguez has pledged to, he said that Delcy Rodriguez has pledged to end Venezuela's oil lifeline to the Cuban regime, and she's well aware of the fate of Maduro. So that was trying to sort of scare the Cubans a bit there.
The other thing that has been happening when I say cracks forming in the Republican Party, yes, we've seen Rand Paul being one of the multiple Republicans that have been publicly condemning various moves from Trump and his inner circle. There are a few others, a few of them who are retiring, so they have the ability to be able to do that because they don't have, elections coming up at the end of the year. But Tom Tillis is a Republican senator who has said multiple things as of late, but one of them is that he has been speaking about Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem after what's been happening in Minnesota and the ICE raid. So he said she is a complete failure on a disaster response, says that the department is asleep at the switch. He said she clearly doesn't know how to manage. She's never managed a large organization and she's failing at every possible measure of the job. Then Trump came out and called Tom Tillis a loser. And he responded saying, I'm thrilled about that. That makes me qualified to be the head of Homeland Security. So, I mean, this isn't just another way of showing that the Trump administration potentially turning on each other. But Bethany, it's quite wild to come out and call for your fellow Republican to be fired from their job.
100%. I mean, first of all, as much as it's nice to see Trump being criticised, the line about "I'm excited to be called a loser," it's not exactly Churchill levels of wit, is it? But no, it is great to see that. But it is a sign that Kristi Noem is under pressure because on Tuesday, Democratic leaders in the House of Representatives released a statement threatening that she should be fired or they'd commence impeachment proceedings. And they said we can either do this the easy way or the hard way. And as you say, Lisa Murkowski and Tom Tillis have both called for her to resign. Even John Thune has said that the killing of Alex Pretty is an inflection point about ICE, and he wouldn't say if he had confidence in her. That being said, despite this war of words that we're seeing about Kristi Noem, I think that she is probably safe for the foreseeable. Because doesn't want to give his opponents a victory by getting rid of her. He might wait a few weeks. He doesn't want to be seen to be responding. He doesn't want to be seen as this another instance of Trump always chickens out. He might have gotten rid of her in the first administration when there was that churn of senior leaders and officials, but I don't think this time. He wants to be seen to reward loyalty, and he doesn't want a long confirmation fight for a replacement. She met with Trump in the Oval Office on Monday. He said on Tuesday that she won't be stepping down. There are reports that she blamed Stephen Miller, saying that everything she'd done was at the direction of the president and Miller. And then Miller denied the blame placed on him for the massacre statement, instead deflecting the fault to information provided by Customs and Border Protection, which is under her Department of Homeland Security. But I think that this issue with Kristi Noem, it isn't over, because Chuck Schumer and his Senate Democrats have announced that they're withholding their votes for the funding package until the White House commits to major reforms in its immigration force. And he had a meeting with Senator Chris Murphy on Tuesday, wanting reforms like body cameras, independent investigations, and into-roving patrols. And some Democrats say that they're getting more calls about ICE than they did about healthcare subsidies, which was the topic of the last shutdown. And some other Democrats are concerned that they perhaps shouldn't focus on immigration because that's an issue that's divided the party in the past, should perhaps be focusing on the cost of living and inflation. However, this morning there were reports that Schumer and Trump have moved to reach an agreement to negotiate new restrictions on ICE that could have a shutdown. The Senate would carve out legislation funding the Department of Homeland Security from a border package. But if there's no deal, we could see a lot of the US government shut down this weekend.
Just a final question, Bethany. According to the Institute for the Study of War, Russian forces are increasingly relying on Starlink satellite systems on its attack drones to massively extend how far they can fly and strike. Apparently it's up to 500 kilometers. So we know that Zelensky has called for more defense support from air defense support from its allies, because there is a shortage right now. But I wonder how Elon Musk can step up and stop Russia from using Starlink. Of course, he's not selling them contracts because it's forbidden under US sanctions, but rather somehow finding a way to stop Russia from obtaining them on the black market, stealing it from Ukraine or dodgy resellers. Is there a way in which we see Elon Musk actually step up to stop Russia from using a system that they've become so heavily reliant on in their ambitions to strike further into Ukraine?
He 100% should. Earlier this month, there was the first recorded usage of Starlink-equipped BM-35 attack drones, and those are taking advantage of Ukraine lacking air defense systems, and we know that the Russians are increasingly using Starlink to extend the range of operations of their drones. And this actually isn't just about Ukraine, because Moldova and also parts of Lithuania, Romania and Poland are in range of those drones if launched from Russia or occupied Ukraine. And we saw that the Polish Foreign Minister, Radek Sikorski, accused Musk of making money on war crimes and said it could damage his brand. And Musk replied, "This drooling imbecile doesn't even realize that Starlink is the backbone of Ukraine military communications." But Musk should 100% intervene. In March, he claimed that Starlink was the backbone of Ukraine's army and their entire front line would collapse if you turned it off. And then Sikorski said that Poland was paying all this money for Ukraine to access Starlink. So we know that back in September 2022, there was a Reuters investigation which said that Musk had ordered SpaceX to cut internet coverage at that time, and that disrupted the Ukrainian counteroffensive. So we know that Musk does have his ways in order to control how this is used. So 100% he needs to make sure that the Russians are not accessing this equipment.
And two things can be true. The Ukrainian military can rely on Starlink, and he can also help cut Russia off from stealing this technology, and which gives them the ability to strike further and fly further into Ukraine. Bethany Elliott, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you so much for having me.